Most people think of trauma, they associate it with personal things. When did you first realize that it was showing up in the workplace as well?
Actually, I would say in the biggest moment of linking trauma and leadership had to be COVID.
What are the most common signs, though, that a team or organization even is operating under trauma that maybe they haven't acknowledged?
Poor team performance, where everybody is operating like an individual contributor. They're working very long hours, kind of in parallel play. In organizations, sometimes you see people with no boundaries whatsoever, either.
You have a 5-phase model for trauma recovery. Could you walk us through it and tell us how it applies to leaders?
I think there's actually a model that holds 3 different phases.
You've heard about trauma recovery and therapy, but what about in the boardroom? Dr. Gretchen Schmelzer has helped the United Nations, federal agencies, and Fortune 500s navigate leadership in the shadow of trauma. Now, if your team is burnout, disengaged, or just off, this conversation is going to change how you lead. So welcome to the show.
It's so good to be here with you.
I appreciate you taking the time. It's not always easy. But let's just jump right in. Most people think of trauma they associate it with personal things. When did you first realize that it was showing up in the workplace as well?
Actually, I would say in the biggest moment of linking trauma and leadership had to be COVID. So I did work with the UN in Cambodia, and that was obviously a country that had experienced significant trauma, but that wasn't standard workplace trauma. And during COVID, I had been writing a book, Journey Through Trauma, but meanwhile doing standard leadership stuff. So working with banks, working with, Comcast, different groups. And during lunch breaks, I'd be talking to the HR people about the book I was writing, and they were all friendly about it and excited for me. But, that was separate. It was like that was one part of my life and leadership was another. And then during COVID, I started getting all these phone calls from people saying, remember that book about trauma that you wrote? All our people are freaking out. My managers don't know how to handle. There are people who are now crying and so upset. And so I started doing lots and lots of webinars for organizations around trauma.
That's really interesting because the pandemic, interestingly, kind of pushed my tech business to a new level. I got asked to do things that I would have never expected because everyone spent so much time locking down their networks so you couldn't get in from the outside. And then suddenly they needed to undo all of those things to allow people to get in from the outside, or at least provide solutions for their employees. So
Right.
that was I actually think it's going to become, when we look back in history, I think that that 2-year time period is going to be very interesting for society because I see a lot of pivots that have been made just in like hospitality. I mean, like here I live in Las Vegas, and how things are handled here now used to be like buffet central. Now I think there's maybe 5 buffets total in the whole city. And
Oh,
just
right.
everything is handled differently, to avoid public health issues. So what are the most common signs, though, that a team or organization even is operating under trauma that maybe they haven't acknowledged?
Poor team performance, where everybody is operating like an individual contributor, even though they're a team. So people have pulled to themselves. They're not collaborating. They're working very long hours, kind of in parallel play. Or people, in organizations, sometimes you see people with no boundaries whatsoever. Either they won't leave. Even on their days off, they're checking things, they're, logging back in. Or it's the opposite. They've checked out and you can't get them and they're not responding to emails.
That's really interesting because it brought me back to a time when I was a retail manager and worked for a chain that sold records. And we had a particular manager. She was very high strung, and our district manager literally had to sit her down and say, like, you have to take days off. Can't always be at your store. And she was just so worried that, the sale wasn't going to get set up correctly and this wasn't going to get set up correctly. And I remember thinking back then that she was traumatized, right? Like by her job. And I remember having a conversation with the district manager and saying, have you ever thought that maybe the reason Tracy's always at work is because the trauma she's experiencing, about maybe things slipping through the cracks. Maybe you could help her with that, because I've always been one who like looks at the how is something affecting the people
Hmm.
in the organization. Like we were really at that company, we were really big on using the term coach rather than manager. And I used to say that doesn't do a lot of good unless you actually act like a coach. So
Right.
why do you think though that trauma gets overlooked in leadership training?
Boy, that's a big question. I mean, I think leadership training gets overlooked in leadership
Yeah.
training. So we could start there. I mean, I've spent a lot of my career working with leaders around emotional intelligence and teaching emotional intelligence, which at its heart is the basis of what you would have to do to get people ready to lead through trauma, right? And the funny thing about that is there's no losing to teach leaders emotional intelligence. There's no downside. And if we just got everybody level setted on solid emotional intelligence with leadership training, my job of helping people lead through trauma would be very easy.
That makes sense. I mean, like you nailed it because I feel the same way. I don't think leadership is taught properly at all. I'd almost hazard to say that leadership isn't taught. They only teach people how to be managers. And to the listeners, I mean, you could even Google this and you'll find out that it's true. A manager is very different from a leader. There's might be overlap, but a manager's not a leader. And you can pretty much make a monkey a manager if you teach them, what paperwork needs to get filled out. They'll do it for you, but they're certainly not going to inspire people and give and inspire them to like innovate and do things like that. So like that leads me to you've worked with the UN, you've worked with NASA, all types of companies in between. How do high functioning organizations still fall into the trauma trap?
Stress, extreme stress puts us in survival mode. And the more mission driven an organization is, the more likely they are to put themselves in that mode because it's actually hard to slow down when you're very mission driven. So, when I've worked with like state employees during the pandemic, they were super mission driven about meeting the needs of the citizens of their state. And therefore, they were not slowing down. They were not taking days off. They were not taking care of themselves. They were sort of sacrificing themselves on behalf of whoever. And that's true of any mission-driven organization as you start to move into sacrifice.
I think having a mission just in various aspects of life can cause a lot of stress. Like I think back to there was a time in my life where I lost 80 pounds and I was working with a trainer. And for 4 weeks, he had me eating perfectly clean. And then one week he said, all right, this week I want you to go to In-N-Out Burger and I want you to have whatever you want there. Just eat whatever you want. And I remember feeling so horrible because I thought to myself, my gosh, I'm undoing all the progress that I did, all this time. And then he says to me, Mike, do you really think one meal is going to undo the last 4 weeks? Of course it's not. Your body
Right.
needs this. And he says, but more importantly, your brain needs it. It needs to know that it's okay to eat this once in a while and the world's not coming to an end. And it's funny, the first like 3 or 4 of those that he gave me caused me stress. But then after a while, you begin to realize, oh, this works. It's no different with I coach my clients. You got to take your days off. And like by take your days off, I mean, no, you're not available to answer questions and you're not available for that. You have a number two in command for a reason. Use them as that person. And
Right.
when you start to do that, you do lower the stress at work even. And I think it kind of applies to all areas of life. But you have a 5 phase model for trauma recovery. Could you walk us through it and tell us how it applies to leaders?
Sure. By and large, when leaders run into trauma, I think of there's actually a model that holds 3 different phases. One would be crisis management. If you come into trauma as a crisis. So I worked with an organization that had a tornado hit nearby. So that's obviously a crisis, and you have to help your organization manage through that. And the goal of crisis is stabilization. You stabilize your team and what you're doing. If you have a job where trauma's routine, let's say I work with emergency room physicians, for example, There's always going to be trauma on that job. It's never not going to be a day where there's trauma. So you have to have maintenance and repair in that job. You have to take care of yourself. So you have to have good routines, good norms. You have to have self care, and you have to build what I call base camp, which I'll get to in the healing cycle. But sometimes trauma is bigger than just managing through maintenance and repair. So we've worked with the U.S. Forest Service with our center, and there were a group of firefighters who actually lived through a fire going over the building they were in. And they survived it, and they put out the fire eventually, but it impacted them over the long haul. And so that's when you need to go back and do the 5-phase cycle of healing. The first phase is preparation. So I liken healing from trauma to a high altitude climb. Because at a high altitude climb, if you're hiking on top of Everest, you're still doing something you've been doing since you were 3 years old. You're walking, but it's much harder up there. And when you're healing from trauma, you're still doing things you've done before, which is to talk and to seek support of other people and deal with your own self and awareness, but it's just much harder. So you want to have a good preparation phase. You want to make sure your resources are strong. You want to make sure you have good self-awareness, that you understand emotions and can name them. And then you want to have a good support system. So I talk about doing this thing called building base camp. And base camp's really, base camp on Everest is 18,000 feet. It's still a hard hike, but you want to have a place where you can acclimatize, where you can make sure your equipment's safe, where you can talk with your team and make sure you have a good communication. So in the preparation phase, you build base camp by making sure you know what your strengths are, having good solid routines, knowing who's on your team. And by team, I mean the same team that the Tour de France guys have. Like the Tour de France guys have an entourage. They have a nutritionist, a mechanic, and all those people. And you want to make sure you have those people, whether it's a coach like you do with people, or whether it is the person who you call when you need somebody to tell it to you straight. Or the person you call who's just going to tell you you're wonderful no matter what. You need your people around you. And then you also need to know when it's time to slow down and come back to base camp. So what are your warning signs that it's time to slow down and come back? And once you've established that in preparation, the next phase is unintegration. And partly because the way trauma works, repeated trauma is really 3 forms of trauma. It's what happened, the things that happened to you. The second form is the protections you use to survive the trauma. So the ways you protect yourself and defend yourself. And the third form of trauma is what didn't happen. The things that can't happen while trauma is occurring. So during COVID, people didn't get professional development, for example, right? So in the unintegration phase, you start to lower your defenses because you feel more solid because of the preparation phase. And the defenses coming down means the story can come out. And at an individual level, that might be just sharing your experiences. At a group level, you might have to have a team meeting of the lifeline of this group, because not everybody in the group experienced the trauma the same way, or may not even been there when the trauma happened. Because that's the way teams work. The new guy comes on and he didn't even live through that thing that's actually still impacting him too, right? And as you begin to tell your story, as the trauma comes up and out, you begin to put language to it and name it. So you might say oh, I feel angry. No, I feel disappointed. And you get more and more clear about the feeling that you have, partly because trauma shatters and it's not encoded in a coherent narrative. Trauma gets often encoded in splinters and pieces. And so unintegration is about picking up pieces and naming them and then putting them together. And when it gets put together, that's integration. And 2 things happen in integration. One is often a sense of grief, where you talk about the story and you say, that happened. That happened to me. or that happened to us. And the other is new beginning, which is now that I know it happened, I get to say, now what? I get to imagine the future again because that's moved to the past. And consolidation is working on, which is the fifth phase, is starting to look at, well, what didn't happen. So now what? What needs attending to now that I'm aware of what happened? What haven't we been able to do? What haven't I paid attention to as I've been surviving the trauma and not paying attention to it? So that's the 5 phase cycle.
That's really interesting. I mean, the grief part, I wouldn't have ever thought of the word grief, but like I have a chart of like it's a circle chart, and then it
Mm-hmm.
has emotions around the center
Yep.
and emotions that tie to those emotions as you go out. And there are many, many times I look at that thing and I'll say, I would have never thought that this and this were related, you know. But then when you see the relationship like brought to the surface for you, you see it. And like in this case, I wouldn't have thought of grief as part of the trauma cycle, but it makes sense that it would be because you went through something that caused you massive stress. And I mean, maybe in the end it turned out positive, but while you were in it, you felt like you were dying. So you're going to have some grief over that. I think that's very, very interesting. So I like to kind of mix things up when I do these interviews. So, you know, you were a two-time national champion in rowing.
Yep.
What did that teach you about team trauma under pressure?
Well, it rowing is the ultimate team sport. There's no star in an eight. And when I coached rowing for a while, and when kids would complain about what seat they were in, I would always say there's only 2 seats in a boat, boat and shore. Like
You're either in the
you're
boat or you're not.
you're not, exactly. And it is a sport, I feel like it's a sport where you really learn about leaning on other people, right? You're entirely reliant on everybody around you, and you win together or you lose together. And your hard work all the time. There aren't a lot of races in rowing either. Like if you think of baseball and how many games they have, right? And lots of sports have lots of competition. And rowing, even spring rowing, which is the sprints, I think there are 4 or 5. I mean, it's like you train twice a day all year for 7 or 8 opportunities, right? And so it's also a real chance to put it all together. And I think I really learned about teamwork. I mean, just true how to be reliant on other people and how to let other people, how to be responsible to other people in that sport.
Yeah, it's the kind of sport that like most sports, like if you're on a basketball team and you try you're putting together a good teamwork. You play a game, make an adjustment, play a game, make an adjustment. With a sport like that, like rowing, you have to self-assess as you're practicing and say, okay, we have a problem here that we need to fix because it's too late. When you get to the race time, it's too late. And there's not like 50 more chances to improve. Like you said, there's a handful. And there might only be one or two at even an event, you know, that you can compete in. So you have to fix that right up front. So that's like you don't get the benefit of feedback in practice. You know, you have to do the feedback
Well,
through practicing.
right. I mean, actually, there's a part of the preparation phase of the trauma cycle where and base camp where I talk about having routines. And I believe that comes deeply out of my rowing practice because we had the same warm up for every practice that and every race. We never varied we had 45-minute warm up that was the same every single day from the minute we shoved off the dock. It was, and the beauty of that is that you get to know your baseline, right? So that eight knows its baseline with that warm up. You know how your body should feel at each part of that warm up. And when it's off, then you do that micro adjustment that you were just talking about. And I've tried to bring some of that idea into the workplace by saying you should have routines so that you get to meet your baseline every morning and you're aware of your own being off, sort of too high strung or too apathetic. Like, where am I on the range of where I need to be for today? Right.
So you mentioned routines. What's a common corporate ritual that you think maybe unintentionally reinforces trauma?
Oh, that's a good question. I think that some public awards reinforce, like, I would say they reinforce the trauma of like middle school, right? Of
Yeah.
some people being, only a certain group of people being important. I think there are a lot of, I think what's different in the corporate world is that there are a lot of jobs who are support jobs that would never get an award, but also the place wouldn't run without them.
They're essential. Yeah.
Right? And I feel like the corporate world, rewarding or making certain things very visible without actually saying it was a team effort for everybody to get there. And I'm not saying everybody, like, I'm not a participation trophy person. I think if you win, you win. But I also think that there are other ways to speak to or get the organization to know who's contributing without making it the Oscars.
It's interesting because my mind wandered to when my oldest boy was in elementary school, and he had a girl in his grade whose mom was super competitive. My ex-wife was super competitive. And so those two kids would be constantly competing for the awards that were given out to the students. Every single quarter they'd give out awards, and these two kids would compete. And so, like, you'd look at the kids that didn't get awards a lot, and they're stressing out because they're not getting recognized and they're not getting awards. But then the two kids that get a lot of awards, they're stressing out because they want to get the right award. It's just, it's crazy. That was actually, I think, a really good example that you used, because it created, now that I think about it, it kind of created stress for them when they were really, both of them were really smart kids who kind of cruised through elementary school. They could have had a really low stress experience had it not been for those awards. Those
Right.
awards really, those awards really caused issues. So is there any like leadership advice that you've heard that more often than not actually causes more harm than good?
Well, I think all the leadership advice to like have no emotions in the workplace causes way more harm than good.
100%.
And, I think it's a really, I've talked about this before, but the the whole idea of workplace, the sort of workplace leadership, that what if you interviewed anybody like what's a leader at work, that model was created post World War II. That is the sort of guys come, but that, the 50s and on was the workplace model, and they were veterans. They didn't want to have emotions at work because it was actually PTSD. And by having a quiet workplace, by making sure they never had any emotions or drinking all through lunch or whatever they had to do, they they didn't have to experience them. And I think they created workplaces where they were felt safe, honestly. But that isn't actually, we feel before we think. Having access to our emotions actually makes us better able to lead, not less able to lead. I think what's happening in the workplace right now, and I don't know if you've seen it with the generations, like everybody's like, there's always a generation gap, right? But our Gen X and above was taught to have no emotions at work. So, I spent 20 years teaching emotional intelligence to people so that they could like dial up their emotions. And now I'm in workplaces where I am trying to teach younger people, so physicians, for example, that it's actually okay to shut them down. Like that you can put them
Yeah.
aside, right? And trying to teach people that it's a dial and not a switch. That you want to be able to be in the right state to deliver the results that are necessary, right?
Yeah, yeah. I actually made a comment to my wife yesterday because I saw a video on YouTube, and they were talking about these deportations that are going on. And the person said, you know that this place in here, these are all of like the child rapists and drug traffickers. That's the people that are inside here. And then the other person was like, well, I understand that they're awful people, but they're still people. So we have to do this and we have to do that. And I said to my wife, I said, when did we in society shift so that we were more worried about the rights of the perpetrator than the victim, you know? And she looked at me and she's like, I really have no idea. And it's true. I think the younger generation, I see it with my youngest daughter a lot. You know, my youngest daughter, my youngest son are both Gen Z. And thankfully, sorry, Gen Z people, but thankfully they don't have the work ethic that a lot of Gen Z people don't seem to have. They actually have a work ethic, but I noticed the over emotional reaction to certain things that I just say to myself, as a leader, I totally grasp that. You have to show your emotions to your team and you have to be vulnerable and all that. But then there are just certain things that like a decision's been made. It's a little too late now to be super emotional that the decision was made. It's been made. You got to kind of deal with it. I really do think it is a generational shift. But and it'll remain to be seen whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, right? I mean, I can see both sides of that too. I think that there's something positive, like you said, we were brought up to stuff the emotions down at work. Don't have emotions here. And so like I can remember hearing like seeing a woman in an office that I know from my work and she's in tears because she had a meeting and nobody wants to go in and talk to that person because you're not supposed to have those kind of emotions here. Nowadays, it's completely the opposite and it's overly emotional, but we'll see. Could it be that that's a better thing? At least they're expressing their emotions. They just need to learn, I think, how to harness that a little bit better so that we don't have nothing but emotional discussions at work as well. But I think emotion, like I'm a big believer in groupthink, believe it or not. I think, and the reason that I am is that I think that some people are really in tune with their emotions. Some people are not. Some people really think things through deeply. Some people are more of the wing it kind of people.
Hmm.
And so when you have a group like that and you throw an idea out there and then you actually listen to the feedback you get, you can figure out which direction to go with things based off of what the group thinks. Because if they all kind of point in one direction, it's probably the right decision, right? So I have one final question for you before I ask you to tell people how to find you. And that is if every leader watching this today could remember just one thing about trauma in the workplace, what do you hope that it would be and why does it matter now more than ever?
Well, I think one of the most important things to remember is that the greatest predictor of extreme stress or post-traumatic stress disorder is good leadership. So if they can actually first focus on solid leadership, emotional intelligence, communication, connecting with their team, being a developmental leader, caring about their people and the development of their people, then they'll be providing the basis for trauma-informed leadership.
I think that's an excellent answer. I'm glad that people like you exist because as a society, like we've said multiple times in this interview, we don't get taught how to lead. Just in general, we don't get taught how to lead. Most people either are followers or like box checkers, you know? So why don't you let the audience know where they can connect with you if they'd like to find out more about you?
Sure. You can go to our website, the Center for Trauma and Leadership.com. And we offer leadership programs, we offer coaching programs, and we can support teams and organizations to manage stress and lead through trauma.
Well, Gretchen, thank you so much for being here and sharing your important perspective. The truth is, too many leaders are stuck trying to optimize performance without addressing the emotional weight that their teams are carrying. So I really appreciate you being here.
Thanks so much. It was great to talk to you.
All right. Well, if today's interview hit home for you, and if you felt seen, challenged, or maybe even a little bit uncomfortable, don't go about it alone. That's exactly why I created the Executive Tech Alliance. It's our private community for leaders who want to grow in the real world, not just on paper. And I'm talking leadership. So trust me, what I've got for you next, you're not going to want to miss. So stick around until the end. And remember, new episodes of Gaining the Technology Leadership Edge every Wednesday on YouTube and LinkedIn at 8 a.m. Pacific time.